We already saw a couple of constraints, right? We saw primary constraints, primary key constraints, foreign key constraints, right? We already saw some constraints on the data types, whether they're dates or integers, varchar, whatnot, right? We can provide other constraints, like for instance, we might say that something is required, right? That it's not null, right? That we might say that a username or an email is required, right? And the way we do that is not null. Null in a database means that we don't know the value. It doesn't mean that it's empty string. It doesn't mean that it's 0 or false or any of those, right? It means that we don't have a value. Somebody just didn't fill out some information on some form, right? And it's not by default empty string, right? It's just we don't know the value, meaning that it cannot be compared against, right? We can't compare it on saying, is it equal, not equal, is it whatever? So be careful. So here we're saying that PID, the primary key, is required, right? Meaning if you try to insert into a database and you don't give me that value, I will throw an exception and say, no, something is wrong. I'm not going to accept that record. Also here we see the first example of creating a table, right? To create a table, we use the keyword create and then the name of the table, right? And then use a parentheses to list the fields in that table. The syntax is we have the name of the fields, right, listed, name of the field, then their data type as integer or varchar. Varchar is like strings, and you can tell me what the size of the string is. And then after the declaration of the data type, you can put any number of constraints, whether it's a primary key, whether it's unique, whether it's not null. You can specify any number of constraints, or that has to be equal to some pattern. Here, the first constraint we're looking at is not null, right? Meaning you have to give me the value there. Or you can tell me that a particular value is unique, right? So for instance, if you tell me it's a username or email, then that might be a good place to use a unique constraint there, right? That if that particular field in that particular table repeats, right, I will not let you either update or insert, right, the record, right, if it's not unique. Now different vendors have different syntax. In MySQL, to set something as unique is it's a unique and then the name of the field, right, in its own line. Whereas in SQL Server, you establish that constraint as part of this when you declare the field itself, right? So slight differences like that. You should always read the documentation for your particular vendor. Other constraints, you can name your constraints, right? So for instance, if you're saying that something is unique or not null or whatever, or whether it's a primary key, a foreign key, whatever constraint you're adding, right? You can name that constraint. You can give it a name, right? By using the keyword constraint and then the name of the constraint. And the reason you might want to name it is that perhaps later you might want to change the constraint, right? And so, for instance, if you provide the constraint but you don't give it a name, right, you can't change it later, right? You would have to like drop the table and recreate the table from scratch. Instead, if you give it a name, you can use keywords such as alter, and alter allows you to say, hey, alter this constraint. It used to be whatever, and now I want to change it to something else. So if you want to change a constraint, you need to name it. To set a field to be the primary key on MySQL, you use the keywords primary key and then in parentheses, which field is the primary key, right? Now notice that when you declare a field to be primary key, it also adds the constraint that it's unique, right? And also adds the constraint that it's not null, right? So notice here we have a primary key, PID not null, kind of twice. It's redundant, right? We've set it here formally, but the primary key already sets up those two constraints. It's unique and it's not null. It also sets up a couple of other constraints, right? If some other records have a foreign key that is relating to us, right? If there are any records that are pointing to this field, to a record with this field, it adds the constraints that you cannot remove that record, right? It's like a folder that contains a document. You can't remove the folder until you remove the inner document. Same thing, right? So that constraint is also, it's called the relational integrity constraint, right? The integrity means you cannot have records that are orphans, right? If I am pointing to you, then the parent can't go away until the child goes away, right? In SQL Server, the syntax is slightly different. You declare primary key right on the field as opposed to a separate line, but it means the same thing. The primary key could be a combination of keys, right? You might say that your primary key is a combination of both this artificial key combined with last name. That needs to be unique. The combination of the two need to be unique, right? So those two now cannot be null, right? And the combination needs to be, meaning that last name could repeat. Yes? So two people can have the same last name, but combined with the primary key, it cannot be the same. Yes, the combination cannot be the same. Foreign key constraints, you use the foreign key keyword, right? So foreign key, and then which field here is the foreign key. So PID here is a foreign key, meaning there must be a primary key on some other record that we are referring to. And we just say, what are we referring to? We're referencing some other table, right? Who has a primary key, right? So we're referring to that field. And again, this is enforced using the relational integrity constraint, right? Now notice that the foreign key can repeat, right? So the foreign key does not add the unique constraint on it. You can have many orders pointing to the same person, right? Which is totally fine. So in SQL Server is slightly different. And again, we can name the constraint, right? So the foreign key constraint, we can name it so that later on, if we want to change it using the alter keyword, we can do so. A multi-field constraint, but using foreign key, right? So notice that this foreign key is referring to two fields, right? If the primary key on the other side is a combination of fields, right? So here I can refer to those two fields, right, that live in that other table, column 1 and column 2. Default allows you to establish a default value, right? If you don't give me the value of a particular field, I'm going to default it to a particular value, right? If you don't give me what city you're in, then I'll choose Lowell by default. Everybody lives in Lowell. I can also set the default date, right? Like the order date. This is very common to usually for audit purposes, we might have two additional fields here of when was this record created first? When was this record first inserted? So we could have, typically we use two names for those. We use created at and updated at. So created at, we would say that the default is get date, right? And we can also put in on update. On update, meaning it'll update the value of that field, right? Whenever, and we can give it the value of a get date, right? Or current date, so that we can like track when was the last time this field was this record was updated. Now the primary key, usually we are responsible for making sure that it's unique, right? That somebody's referencing it and whatnot. But oftentimes we can delegate that to the database and say, hey, database, I don't want to be responsible for creating these unique identifiers. I'm going to leave it up to you. I'm going to leave it, hey, database, you come up with a unique identifier, right? And so in MySQL, we use the auto increment field keyword, and this will start usually from 1, then 2, 3, 4. Different vendors might implement it slightly different. Some will start like 10, 20, 30, 40, right? And you can configure. Typically, you can configure where to start, and then you can configure like the step, right? But typically, it starts at 1 and then increments to infinity. Okay. SQL Server has something similar, but instead of auto increment, it's identity, right? But it does the same thing. So for instance, if we do an auto increment on inserting and creating a brand new record, so insert, as you might imagine, insert allows you to insert a brand new record into a table. So here we're inserting a new person, and presumably we have had auto increment on the primary key of persons, right? That means that when I insert, notice that I do not have as a field here the primary key. I am not providing the primary key, right? So By default, what will happen is that the database will come up with a initial value of that primary key, and then we'll insert it. Now, insert has two syntax, right? Syntax. The first syntax is you provide the name of the fields, first name, last name, and then the values, right? Lars and Monson. Yes. In that case, you're telling me exactly which fields you're inserting and their values, right? But insert also has another syntax where you don't provide the name of the fields, right? If you don't provide the name of the fields, somehow it needs to know the values. What do they relate to? Which fields do they match? In that case, it uses the order in which the fields were declared, right? So here in persons noticed that the fields were declared. The first one was the primary key, second was last name, next was first name. See that? That means that this insert here, because you didn't tell me the fields, I'm going to assume the first one is the ID, primary key, and then the first name and then the last name. Yes? But because it's auto increment and I don't want to bother, I'm just going to say null. I'm going to leave it up to you. You choose the primary key value. Make sense? Right? If I give you an actual value, then sure, I'll take your value. Right? But if you don't give it to me, I'll just create it for you and guarantee its uniqueness. In Oracle, unfortunately, there is no equivalent on auto increment. Instead, we need to create what is called a sequence. We have to say, first create a sequence that goes from 1 to infinity, right, or some really, really big number, and it will generate all the values, and then say, hey, my primary key, right, the values for my primary key, go fetch the next value from that sequence. Right? I think that's an unfortunate way of implementing, right? But nevertheless, here's the equivalent. We first create the sequence starting at a particular value, and then incrementing by some increment. And then with a person, when I insert, we would refer to the name of that sequence and get the next value in the sequence. Right? Kind of a weird hack there. But that's how you would do the same thing in Oracle.